When we think of ancient Rome, we usually imagine emperors wearing golden wreaths, generals leading legions, and crowds filling the Colosseum. But behind the marble monuments and military triumphs, there was another Rome, one driven by desire, escape, and altered states of mind. The same society that gave us laws, aqueducts, and political institutions was also deeply involved with drugs. From the streets of Pompeii to the palaces of emperors, substances that changed perception, dulled pain, or stirred pleasure flowed as freely as wine. Life in the Roman Empire was anything but easy. Imagine living in a world where war could erupt at any border, where plagues swept through cities without warning, where food shortages turned hunger into a constant companion, and where natural disasters could destroy entire communities overnight. For ordinary citizens and emperors alike, stress, uncertainty, and grief were part of daily existence. And when life becomes unbearable, people search for relief. The Romans found it in substances that blurred the lines between medicine, entertainment, and poison. The most obvious and most celebrated of these was wine. To a Roman, wine was not just a drink, it was a cultural anchor, an expression of identity, and a divine gift. It was poured in honor of the gods, consumed in lavish banquets, and shared during funerals as a bridge between the living and the dead. Public festivals in honor of Bacchus, the god of wine, often turned into massive spectacles of intoxication. In those moments, drunkenness was not a shameful weakness, but a way to connect with divinity. Yet even as wine flowed through every aspect of Roman life, not everyone saw it as harmless. Writers like Pliny the Elder described the toll of excessive drinking: trembling hands, sleepless nights, and wild desires that pushed men into reckless behavior. The philosopher Seneca warned that drunkenness stripped away dignity and revealed the darkest parts of a person's soul. To him, a drunk man was not merely sick, he was unmasked. Still, moderation was praised, and many Romans believed wine in small amounts could grant strength, courage, and even sexual vigor. But wine was only the beginning. The Romans also embraced plants and substances that took them far beyond simple intoxication. Among these, opium stood out as both miracle and menace. Derived from the poppy, opium was widely respected as a powerful medicine. Physicians prescribed it for headaches, fevers, insomnia, stomach complaints, and even scorpion stings. Mixed with honey, it became a popular remedy to calm restless nights. For the exhausted citizen or soldier, it offered peace in a world full of chaos. Yet the same drug that soothed pain could just as easily bring death. Ancient physicians and poets alike wrote of overdoses where the body grew cold, lips swelled, breathing slowed, and the victim drifted into a fatal sleep. Everyone knew that the poppy's gift was twofold: healing when used with care, destruction when taken too far. This double-edged nature gave opium a unique place in Roman society as cure, as poison, and even as a weapon in political plots. Few figures illustrate the paradox of opium better than Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Known as the philosopher king, Marcus followed the principles of Stoicism, a philosophy that prized reason, discipline, and self-control. He was not a man of indulgence, yet even he turned to opium in carefully measured doses. According to accounts from his physician Galen, Marcus mixed the drug with honey, adjusting the quantity each night so he could rest without clouding his judgment during the day. To him, opium was not an escape, but a tool, an aid that allowed him to remain sharp enough to lead an empire at war. This paints a striking contrast with the darker uses of the same substance. For while Marcus used it to preserve clarity, others weaponized it for power. Nero, one of Rome's most infamous emperors, allegedly used opium to eliminate his young stepbrother Britannicus. During a banquet in the year 55 AD, Britannicus drank from a poisoned cup, collapsed in front of the guests, and died soon after. Roman historians claim the dose had been prepared by Locusta, a notorious poisoner employed by Nero. What looked like a sudden illness was, in reality, a calculated murder that cleared Nero's path to uncontested rule. And this was not an isolated case. In a world without forensic science, overdoses were convenient tools. A strong infusion of opium could silence political rivals, unwanted heirs, or troublesome spouses, all under the guise of natural death. It was the perfect poison, widely available, socially acceptable, and lethal in the right amount. But opium was not used only to kill. Many Romans turned to it at the end of their own lives. Suicide, unlike in many modern societies, was not forbidden in Rome. In certain situations, old age, terminal illness, unbearable suffering, it could even be considered an honorable choice. For those seeking a gentle exit, a cup of wine laced with opium provided a peaceful departure. To fall asleep and never wake again was, to some, the most dignified way to meet death. Beyond its medicinal and deadly uses, opium also seeped into the culture of pleasure. Some Romans sought out its dreamlike effects, chasing visions and sensations that seemed to transport them beyond the ordinary world. It became part of a broader Roman fascination with substances that altered the mind. For a society obsessed with both control and excess, opium symbolized the delicate balance between mastery and surrender. What makes this especially fascinating is how openly it was accepted. Unlike the taboos surrounding drugs in many modern cultures, Rome treated opium as just another part of daily life. Apothecaries sold it in markets. Physicians prescribed it without shame. Families grew poppies in their gardens alongside vegetables and herbs. To the Romans, there was nothing illicit about it. It was as ordinary as olive oil or salt. Yet the dangers were never far away. Ancient authors describe scenes of addicts who could no longer function without the drug, men and women caught in cycles of dependence long before the concept of addiction existed. Rome, it seems, understood the cost of indulgence even if it lacked the vocabulary to name it. And while opium carried this double reputation as healer and killer, it was far from the only substance shaping Roman life. The empire was filled with plants and potions that could provoke hallucinations, stir laughter, or plunge the mind into chaos. If opium was the Roman gateway to dreams and death, the world of hallucinogenic plants was a doorway into visions, madness, and sometimes ecstasy. The Romans knew well that nature was full of secret seeds, roots, and leaves that could bend the mind and body in strange directions. These substances were often mysterious, feared and revered in equal measure, and they carried reputations that blurred the boundary between medicine, sorcery, and entertainment. One of the most notorious was mandrake. The root of this plant, twisted and human-like in shape, was wrapped in myth and superstition. Legends whispered that pulling it from the ground unleashed a deadly scream, powerful enough to kill anyone who heard it. To avoid this, some said you should tie a dog to the plant and let the animal uproot it, sparing the human gatherer. In practice, Romans used mandrake as a powerful anesthetic, especially before surgeries, but it was also believed to spark vivid dreams and erotic visions. Small doses promised comfort. Too much invited delirium and collapse. Then there was belladonna, meaning beautiful lady in later Italian, because it was said women used its extracts to dilate their pupils, creating an alluring gaze. In Rome, its uses were more dangerous. Tiny amounts could calm pain or relax muscles, but larger doses blurred vision, induced hallucinations, and sometimes caused terrifying fits. It was a plant both desired and dreaded, often associated with witches and magic due to its unpredictable power. Wormwood, another plant in the Roman pharmacological arsenal, had a more bitter story. This herb, later infamous as the base of absinthe, was valued for sharpening the mind and lifting the spirits. Roman physicians mixed it with wine to treat digestion and melancholy. Yet even then, some noted its darker effects. Disturbing dreams, bursts of overconfidence, and in high quantities, outright insanity. Archaeological finds even suggest that amphorae of wormwood-infused wine were stored in villas near Pompeii, evidence of how common such potions were despite their dangers. And of course there were the mushrooms. Not just the edible kind sautéed with olive oil, but the so-called fungi delicti, the crime mushrooms prized for their hallucinogenic power. Emperors themselves were rumored to have consumed them, whether in search of visions or in reckless indulgence. Some Roman texts suggest that a feast could turn into a hallucinatory spectacle after these mushrooms were served, with diners laughing uncontrollably, seeing strange shapes, or trembling in fear of monsters that weren't there. These effects blurred the line between entertainment and danger. A single bite too many could silence the laughter forever. Even the sea held its own hallucinogen. A fish known as the dream bream, common in Mediterranean waters, was believed to cause vivid kaleidoscopic hallucinations when eaten in large portions. Imagine a banquet where guests, after a heavy fish course, began reporting visions as if Neptune himself had whispered secrets into their minds. Whether this was caused by toxins in the fish or simply legend, it reveals the Roman appetite for exploring every possible doorway into altered consciousness. These substances were not hidden away. They were traded in markets, grown in gardens, and discussed by poets and philosophers. For the Romans, experimenting with the mind was as much a part of life as building roads or conquering provinces. The thrill of reaching beyond ordinary reality was irresistible. But with every new experiment came risk, and the Romans often paid the price. Addiction, madness, and even death lurked behind the allure of these plants. Yet their popularity never faded, showing us a civilization endlessly curious about the limits of human experience. While opium and hallucinogens carried a sense of danger and mystery, cannabis had a more versatile and approachable place in Roman life. It was not originally native to Italy. It traveled westward with nomadic peoples like the Scythians, who were famous for their smoke rituals. The Greek historian Herodotus described how these tribes threw hemp seeds onto hot stones, covered themselves with tents, and inhaled the dense fumes until they howled with joy. Roman merchants and soldiers eventually carried the plant into the heart of the empire, where it quickly found new uses. The most practical use was in hemp fiber. Strong, durable, and resistant to salt water, it became essential for making ropes and sails, two things that sustained Roman trade and naval power. In this way, cannabis was woven directly into the empire's infrastructure. A Roman warship, slicing across the Mediterranean, was held together in part by strands of hemp. Without it, the logistics of empire would have been far more difficult. But the plant's flowers and resin were equally valued. Roman physicians recognized their medicinal qualities, prescribing cannabis to ease joint pain, calm stomach troubles, and even drive out parasites. Pliny the Elder noted its numbing effects, and Galen observed how it was served at banquets to lift the spirits of guests. He described it as a social drug, one that turned ordinary gatherings into lively affairs full of laughter. Recreationally, cannabis often appeared in the form of fumigation. Instead of smoking it as we imagine today, Romans followed the Scythian tradition of inhaling vapors. Bundles of hemp were burned alongside incense, filling the air with aromatic smoke. Guests would gather under cloths or in enclosed spaces to breathe it in, creating an atmosphere somewhere between a religious ritual and a party trick. The results were unpredictable, sometimes hilarity, sometimes drowsiness, occasionally visions. Interestingly, cannabis was not always associated with pleasure. Some medical writers noted that excessive use could reduce desire, dampening sexual impulses. In fact, this was sometimes presented as an advantage. For soldiers or men struggling with self-control, the plant was recommended as a way to cool unruly passions. In this sense, cannabis occupied a strange middle ground, at once a stimulant for laughter and a suppressant of desire. The openness with which cannabis was discussed and consumed shows how different Roman attitudes were from many modern societies. There was no stigma. It was sold openly in markets, side by side with spices and medicinal herbs. Dealers offered it in various forms, oils, powders, and resins, often with advice on how to prepare it for the best effect. To buy cannabis in Rome was as ordinary as buying garlic or olive oil, and beyond medicine and pleasure, the plant was woven into the religious fabric of Roman life. In some rituals, hemp smoke was offered to the gods, rising from altars as a fragrant bridge between humans and the divine. To the Romans, altering the mind could be more than a personal escape, it could be a spiritual journey. In cannabis, the Romans found a substance that was both tool and toy, sacred and profane. It tied ships together, cured ailments, fueled parties, and carried prayers to the heavens. Few plants had such a wide-ranging role in the empire. If cannabis could brighten a banquet, the Romans were quick to see how drugs of all kinds could transform social gatherings. Feasts in the empire were not just about eating and drinking, they were stages where status, wealth, and imagination were displayed. A host who wanted to impress his guests might serve not only rare wines and exotic dishes, but also enhanced concoctions designed to provoke laughter, visions, or deep sleep. These drug-infused banquets blurred the line between celebration and spectacle. Wine mixed with herbs like wormwood or cannabis could circulate the room, its bitterness disguised with honey. Some hosts even prepared multi-drug cocktails combining substances like opium, henbane, and hemp to create unpredictable experiences. Archaeologists in Pompeii uncovered amphorae containing chemical traces of such mixtures, proof that these were not isolated experiments, but part of daily life for many Romans. For the elite, offering unusual drinks and drugs was a way of showing off sophistication and power. To present a wine infused with rare plants from the far edges of the empire was to signal influence. Look what I can obtain. Look what I can provide. Guests would sip, laugh, hallucinate, or fall silent in contemplation, all while acknowledging the prestige of their host. But these gatherings were not always harmless fun. Drugs also played roles in manipulation and control. A host might slip stronger doses to rivals, dulling their wits while keeping his own mind sharp. Enemies could be publicly humiliated, stumbling or raving under the influence, while the manipulator retained his composure. In some cases, doses were strong enough to eliminate opponents entirely, masked by the chaos of feasting. Even outside the elite, drug use found a place in communal settings. In taverns where soldiers and commoners gathered, wine was often laced with herbs to intensify its effects cheaply. Street vendors sold oils and powders promising everything from better sleep to stronger lust. In these spaces, drugs were not luxuries, but everyday commodities. Religion, too, was not separate from indulgence. In the cults of Bacchus and other mystery religions, intoxication was a pathway to the divine. Participants entered trances through drink and smoke, convinced they were communicating with gods or stepping briefly into another realm. These ceremonies could be ecstatic, frightening, or liberating, but to their followers they revealed truths unreachable in sober daylight. Of course, not everyone approved. Conservative voices in Rome saw such feasts and cult rituals as dangerous signs of moral decay. Writers condemned what they saw as the softening of Roman discipline, the erosion of the old martial values that had once conquered the world. To them, intoxication made men weak, unreliable, and unworthy of empire. Yet despite these criticisms, the banquets continued, the cults grew, and the substances flowed. Rome was a place of contradictions, discipline and decadence, control and abandon, marching legions and laughing revelers. The feast table was as much a battlefield of influence as any frontier of the empire. If Roman banquets showcased drugs as entertainment, the political arena revealed their darker side. In the ruthless world of imperial power, substances became weapons, and a single dose could decide the fate of emperors and heirs. No name is more infamous in this shadowy trade than Locusta, the empire's most notorious poisoner. She was not a back-alley figure, but a professional, valued, and even employed by emperors. Her knowledge of plants, minerals, and mixtures made her indispensable to those seeking discreet solutions to dangerous problems. Unlike the sword or the dagger, poison was subtle, silent, and left no obvious trail. Her most famous act came under Nero. In the year 55 AD, Nero sought to remove his stepbrother Britannicus, a potential rival to the throne. At a banquet, Britannicus drank from a cup laced with a carefully measured dose prepared by Locusta. Witnesses described how he collapsed suddenly, choking and convulsing in front of the horrified guests. Officially, the death was explained as epilepsy, but few doubted the truth. The throne was now Nero's alone, secured not by legions but by a woman's expertise with deadly herbs. Locusta's reputation grew so great that she was reportedly kept under imperial protection, her skills rewarded with estates and students to pass on her knowledge. In a world where loyalty shifted with the tides of politics, her craft made her untouchable, at least for a time. But Nero was hardly the only Roman ruler to resort to poison. Throughout the empire, rivals were dispatched in similar ways. Wine cups spiked with opium, bread dusted with powdered belladonna, honey infused with toxic herbs, each method as deadly as it was undetectable. In an age without autopsies or chemical tests, sudden illness could always be attributed to the will of the gods. What made poison so effective was their plausibility. Romans were already accustomed to drugs being part of daily life. A guest who fell ill after drinking wine laced with wormwood or opium raised little suspicion. It was common knowledge that such mixtures could have unpredictable effects. A victim's collapse could be explained as carelessness, gluttony, or simple bad luck. At the same time, the cultural acceptance of suicide provided another layer of ambiguity. If a senator or general died from an overdose, was it murder, or did he choose to slip away peacefully? This ambiguity shielded many assassins, giving them the cover of plausible deniability. The reliance on poison reflected Rome's broader culture of intrigue. Political life was a constant struggle, where survival often depended on removing rivals before they removed you. A legion might win an empire, but a cup of wine could win a throne. For all their laws, legions, and monuments, the Romans never lost sight of one uncomfortable truth. Power was fragile, and sometimes the surest path to it was through a vial of liquid, a pinch of powder, or the hands of a woman like Locusta. As deadly as poisons could be, many Romans turned to mixtures not for murder, but for experimentation. The empire was a laboratory of the human condition, and drugs were part of that grand experiment. To combine substances was to test the boundaries of body and mind. In Pompeii, archaeologists have uncovered amphorae that once contained wines laced with complex blends, traces of opium, cannabis, and henbane together in a single drink. These were not accidental contaminations. They were deliberate recipes designed to amplify effects. A single sip could send one guest into fits of laughter, another into wild hallucinations, and a third into restless sleep. To drink at such a banquet was to gamble with one's own consciousness. Hosts often used these concoctions as statements of prestige. To serve a wine infused with exotic herbs from far-off provinces was to demonstrate wealth, reach, and refinement. Guests might boast afterward not only of the food they ate, but of the visions they saw, visions offered by their host's generosity. In this way, intoxication became a form of social currency, proof of belonging to circles where reality itself could be reshaped for pleasure. But these cocktails also carried risks. The more ingredients combined, the less predictable the outcome. A mixture intended to amuse could easily become lethal. Roman poets hinted at tragedies where lovers, philosophers, or even statesmen died after consuming drinks meant to inspire joy. In such cases, whether the cause was error, excess, or hidden malice, the result was the same. Another reminder that the line between celebration and catastrophe was thin. For ordinary citizens, simpler mixtures circulated in taverns and markets. Oils blended with herbs promised relief from insomnia, Powders dissolved in wine claim to stir passion or sharpen focus. Whether they delivered on these promises or not, they reveal a society that believed deeply in the transformative power of substances. Looking across this landscape of Roman drug use, wine in worship, opium in medicine, cannabis in laughter, hallucinogens in ritual, poisons in politics, we see not chaos, but a pattern of curiosity. The Romans were relentless in their search for ways to expand, escape, or control experience. Sometimes it brought healing, sometimes joy, sometimes ruin. And perhaps that is why their story still feels so familiar. Even 2,000 years later, humanity grapples with the same desires: to ease pain, to find pleasure, to push the boundaries of consciousness, and to wrestle with the dangers that follow. In their pursuit of ecstasy, clarity, or oblivion, the Romans remind us that the struggle between discipline and indulgence is as old as civilization itself. So, when we picture Rome, its marble temples, marching legions, and roaring arenas, we should also imagine another Rome, a society where gardens grew poppies beside lettuce, where incense carried hemp smoke into the air, where emperors measured out spoonfuls of opium with honey, and where laughter, visions, and death could all be poured from the same cup. And that is the hidden side of Roman Empire, not only of laws, legions, and monuments, but also of wine-soaked feasts, opium dreams, cannabis smoke, and deadly poisons disguised as medicine. A civilization that sought pleasure, relief, power, and transcendence through substances that could heal, delight, or destroy. If you enjoyed this journey into the secret life of the Romans, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story from history. And before you go, I invite you to watch the next video recommended here on screen. You'll discover another chapter of the Roman world that's just as fascinating and maybe even more surprising. Thank you for watching. Remember, we are the ones who remember, the ones who question, the ones who refuse to bow to the silence of history. And you, are you ready for the next secret of Rome?